Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. We decided to move to the countryside in search of silence. The city had become a monster of noise and haste that devoured our days. A constant assault on our nerves that left us exhausted at the end of every day. I, Gabriel, only wanted a place where my 8-year-old son, Sergio, could run safely, far from asphalt and traffic. My wife, Marta, longed for a garden and clean air, a horizon that was not sliced by gray buildings. The house we found seemed like an answer to all of that. It was an old house made of stone and wood, set on a low hill and surrounded by acres of forest. It was isolated, perhaps too isolated, several miles from the nearest village. But at that moment, solitude was exactly what we were looking for. A blank canvas. The first few days were idyllic. We unpacked boxes between laughs and planned the future. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Marta seemed happier than ever, with dirt under her nails and the sun on her face. She spent hours planning her vegetable garden. Sergio explored the surroundings with the inexhaustible energy of his 8 years, building imaginary forts among the trees and coming home covered in mud and leaves. I devoted myself to small repairs, feeling with every hammer blow how the stress of the city dissolved. It was a simple life, the life we had dreamed of. But dreams sometimes turn into something else. Everything changed the day Marta decided to clean the attic. It was a spacious area under the roof, full of decades of dust and the forgotten junk of previous owners. A place that smelled of dry wood and time stopped. I was repairing a fence at the property line when she called me. Her voice sounded strange, not alarmed, but tense, with a note of curiosity that unsettled me. I climbed the creaking wooden steps and found her in the center of the attic, covered in dust, illuminated by the beam of light entering through the single skylight. She was standing in front of an object covered by a thick, faded sheet. She pulled it back with a slow motion. It was a mirror, a full-length mirror with a frame of tarnished silver, almost black from the patina. It was not a smooth frame. It was intricately carved with reliefs of twisted vines, leaves, and faces, small, barely perceptible faces that seemed to be writhing in pain or ecstasy. I could not tell which. The glass was opaque with grime, but intact. It was not in the inventory. The former owners had not mentioned it. It was a large, heavy object impossible to overlook. My first impulse was to get it out of there. There was something about it that made me uncomfortable. The way the glass caught the little light in the attic, the coldness it seemed to radiate even from a distance. It was an absurd feeling, but I felt it along the back of my neck. Marta, however, was fascinated. She traced the carvings on the frame with her fingers with an almost reverent delicacy. She said it was beautiful, a valuable antique, a unique piece. She ignored my suggestion to leave it where it was or take it to an antique dealer. She insisted on bringing it downstairs and cleaning it. It took considerable effort to move it down the narrow stairs. We installed it in our bedroom on the wall opposite the bed. It was a mistake. It was the worst mistake of my life. At first, the changes in Marta were subtle, almost imperceptible. I found her several times standing in front of the mirror, motionless, simply staring at her reflection. The mirror, once clean, reflected the room with an unnerving, almost too sharp clarity. When I asked her what she was doing, she took a long time to answer, as if my voice reached her from far away. She would startle and say she was just thinking, admiring the piece. But her vibrant energy began to fade. She stopped working in the garden. Her plants started to wilt from lack of care. Her laughter became rare, forced. She started sleeping poorly, or perhaps not sleeping at all. I would wake up in the middle of the night from a feeling of cold and find her sitting up in bed, motionless, staring at the mirror's dark surface in the gloom. Her silhouette was framed against the pale reflection of the moon. I would ask if she was okay. She would murmur that she just had insomnia, that I should go back to sleep, but her eyes never left the glass. Then her attitude toward Sergio changed. It was the most painful shift. Marta, who adored our son, who lived for his hugs, began to show almost no patience. His noise, his questions, his mere presence bothered her. If Sergio tried to hug her, she would tense up, pushing him away with a coldness that chilled us both. "Not now, Sergio, I am busy," she would say, even when she was doing nothing but staring out the window. Sergio, confused and hurt, began to withdraw. He stopped seeking her out. He started playing alone in his room. I tried to talk to her one night while we were having dinner in a tense silence, broken only by the clinking of cutlery. I suggested that perhaps the isolation was not agreeing with her, that the change had been too sudden, that we could visit the city on the weekend. She looked up from her barely touched plate. She looked at me with eyes that no longer seemed like hers. They were flat, stripped of the warmth I knew, as if she were looking through me. She said she was perfectly fine. She said I was imagining things, that I was exaggerating. Her voice was monotone, emotionless. The house also began to change. The silence we had sought was corrupted. It filled with noises I could not identify. Footsteps in the upstairs hallway when we were all in the kitchen. Doors closing by themselves with a dull thud, as if a gust of wind had passed even though there was no draft. And the smell. A foul odor like spoiled meat and rusty metal. A putrid breath that appeared in random bursts and then vanished without a trace. I inspected the house from top to bottom. I checked the pipes, the basement, the attic. I found nothing. The house felt sick, and the center of that sickness seemed to be our bedroom. The temperature there was always several degrees colder than in the rest of the house, a damp cold that settled into your bones. Sergio was the first to feel the presence directly. He began to have terrible nightmares. He would scream in his sleep, incoherent words about shadows and eyes. He said a bad woman was watching him from his bedroom doorway. At first, I blamed it on the stress of the move and his mother's new coldness. But one night, Sergio's screams woke me. They were not the cries of a nightmare. They were screams of pure terror, sharp and desperate. I jumped out of bed. Marta's side was empty. The cold in the room was intense. I ran down the hallway. Sergio's bedroom door was open. I found him huddled in the corner farthest from the door, shaking violently, hugging his knees and pointing into the dark hallway. He said she had been there, that his mother had been standing by his bed watching him in the dark, not moving, not saying anything, just breathing in a strange way. A harsh sound, like a broken bellows. I ran back to our bedroom, my heart pounding in my throat. Marta was there. She was standing in front of the mirror. Her white nightgown seemed to glow in the darkness. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening to something coming from the glass. A secret whispered only to her. I called her name. Marta. Her name sounded faint in the freezing room. She did not move. I touched her shoulder. The sensation was like touching a block of ice. Her skin was glacial. She turned toward me. She did it slowly, with a fluid, almost inhuman movement, as if her spine had no joints. It was not Marta. The thing looking at me wore her face, but it was not her. Her eyes were completely black, pits of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb the little moonlight coming through the window. A smile spread across her face. It was the most terrifying movement I have ever seen. Her lips stretched too far beyond what is humanly possible, revealing her teeth in a grimace that expressed not joy but a deep, ancient hatred. She opened her mouth. No scream or words came out. A sound came out. A low, guttural sound. A layered whisper that seemed to come from 1,000 throats at once. A legion of voices speaking a dead language. It vibrated in my chest, and the smell of rot filled the room with suffocating intensity. I backed away, tripping over my own feet. The thing wearing Marta's body took a step toward me. It moved with a terrible grace, its feet barely touching the floor. It raised a hand, Marta's hand, but the nails looked longer, darker, almost like claws. It was not looking at me. Its black gaze passed over my shoulder, aimed toward the hallway, toward Sergio's room. In that instant, I knew. I knew it was not a mental illness, it was not stress, it was something ancient, something evil, and it had entered our house. The mirror was not just a mirror, it had been a door. And the thing that had crossed through it was now anchored to my wife. It no longer hid. It no longer pretended. It had been discovered, and now it showed its true intention. I ran to Sergio's room, locked the door and blocked it with a dresser. I could hear it on the other side. It was not banging. It was not screaming. I only heard that low, constant whisper and the slow, deliberate sound of something sharp scratching the wood. I hugged my son, who was crying silently. The house that was supposed to be our refuge had become a death trap. The woman I loved had become the monster stalking us. The fight was not to save my marriage, it was to save my son's life. I understood that the entity did not want us to leave. It wanted us to stay. It wanted us scared. It wanted us broken. The possession of Marta had not been the final goal. It was only the first step. The real prize, I knew with a certainty that chilled my bones, was Sergio, and I was the only thing standing in its way. That certainty hit me like a block of ice. I was the only thing standing between that thing and my son. I was still hugging Sergio, who trembled against my chest, while we huddled behind the dresser blocking the door. My mind raced, searching for an exit, a plan, anything. The sound of claws on the door's wood continued, rhythmic, monotonous, a torture designed to break our nerves. Each scratch was a reminder of the creature waiting on the other side, and then abruptly it stopped. The scratching ceased. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, expectant silence loaded with malevolence. I hugged Sergio tighter, feeling his small tremors against my chest. My ear was pressed to the wood, trying to catch any sound from outside. The guttural whisper had also vanished, but the presence was still there. I could feel it. It was like a drop in air pressure, a coldness that was not physical but spiritual, crushing all hope. We remained like that, huddled behind the dresser for what felt like hours. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, revealing the terror in my son's eyes. He had not slept. Neither of us had. With the arrival of day, the cold in the house seemed to retreat slightly, though not the smell. The stench of rusty metal and decomposed flesh permeated the air. We needed to get out of that room. We needed to get out of that house. With extreme caution, I moved the dresser away, my muscles protesting from the tension. The wood of the door was scarred. Deep scratches, as if made by animal claws, furrowed the paint. I opened the door slowly. The hallway was empty. There was no sign of Marta, just an unnatural silence. I went downstairs first, with Sergio clinging to my hand with desperate strength. Every creak of the wood was torture for my nerves. The ground floor was in shadow. The curtains, which Marta always opened in the morning, were still drawn. The kitchen was empty. The living room, too. But she had been there. Chairs were overturned. Broken dishes littered the floor, as if she had had a fit of blind rage. My gaze instinctively went to the entrance. I grabbed the car keys from the bowl next to the door. My only thought was to get Sergio into the car and drive until we ran out of gas. We reached the front door. I slid the bolt. I pulled the knob. The door would not open. It was stuck. Not physically jammed. The lock turned. It just would not give, as if it were welded to the frame. I pushed with all my weight. It was like pushing against a stone wall. Panic began to bubble in my throat. I ran to the back door in the kitchen. The same result. It was sealed. The windows. I went to the largest living room window. I tried to lift it. It did not budge. I checked the latch. It was open, but the window would not move. I grabbed a chair and, without thinking, slammed it against the glass. The chair bounced off with a dull thud, as if I had hit rubber, and fell to the floor. The glass was intact, not a single crack. We were trapped. The house would not let us out. The entity was holding us captive. "Dad, I am scared," Sergio whispered. I knelt and hugged him. "We are going to be fine, I promise." It was a lie, and we both knew it. The phone. I ran to the landline in the kitchen. I picked up the receiver. There was no dial tone, only dead silence. I checked my cell phone in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was black. I had charged it the night before. I tried to turn it on. It did not respond. It was dead. It was as if an invisible pulse had fried all the electronics. And then we heard her. She was upstairs. We heard her footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She walked along the hallway by our bedroom. Then a new sound. A rhythmic tapping against the wall. One tap. Silence. Another tap. Silence. I looked toward the entryway. She was at the top of the stairs. She was sitting on the top step, her nightgown dirty. Her hair hung over her face. She was knocking her head against the wall. Slowly, rhythmically, with a horrible smile on her face. The same unnatural smile as the night before. She lifted her head. Her black eyes locked on mine. The cold returned with overwhelming intensity. The smell of rot made me recoil. "Gabriel," she said. Her voice. It was not Marta's voice. It was that cacophony of whispers, but now articulating words. The sound was harsh, like broken glass dragged across gravel. "The child is mine." I backed away, grabbing Sergio. We locked ourselves in the downstairs bathroom, the only room without large windows. It was a small, claustrophobic space. I braced the door with my body. I heard her coming down the stairs. Her steps were not human. They were too light, almost as if she were floating, yet each step made the wood creak with unnatural force. She stopped in front of the bathroom door. She did not knock. She did not scratch. She just breathed. I could hear that harsh, deep breathing on the other side of the wood. I could smell it. The stench seeped in under the door. Sergio began to cry silently. I covered his mouth with my hand, even though I knew she could hear us. I could feel her. I could feel her hatred and hunger focused on us. Time lost all meaning. We spent hours in that tiny bathroom. Outside, the house groaned. The noises that had once been subtle were now constant. Banging inside the walls, scratching across the ceiling, and the whisper. The whisper came back, sometimes loud, sometimes barely audible, rising from everywhere at once. Daylight began to fade. Darkness was our enemy. I knew it. We could not spend another night in that house. Not with that thing. There had to be a way out. I waited for the footsteps to move away. When finally there was silence, a silence that lasted almost an hour, I dared to move. I told Sergio we were going to the basement. There was an outside door there, a slanted trapdoor that led to the yard. It was our only chance. We left the bathroom. The house was silent, a tense silence. The thing that was Marta was nowhere in sight. The living room was even more destroyed. The furniture was now piled in the center of the room, forming a kind of grotesque mound. And on the wall where there had been nothing, the mirror now hung. The attic mirror. It was there, in the living room, reflecting the distorted room. I do not know how she had brought it down. I did not want to know. Its surface looked almost liquid, dark. We crept toward the basement door. It was in the kitchen. I opened it. A breath of cold, damp air rose from the stairs. We went down carefully, closing the door behind us. The basement was dark, but I knew the way. The trap door was at the back. We ran through the shadows, tripping over old boxes. I reached the trap door. I grabbed the heavy metal bolt. It was rusty, but it moved. I started pushing the door up. It opened a few inches, letting in a sliver of twilight. Fresh air. We had almost made it. Then the basement door upstairs burst open. The kitchen light went out. A silhouette appeared at the top of the stairs. It was her, Marta, or what was left of her. She was motionless. Then she laughed. It was not a laugh. It was a sharp, inhuman shriek that bounced off the stone walls. She did not come down the stairs. She jumped. She landed on the basement floor on all fours like an animal. Her bones crunched and readjusted. She stood up, her body moving in an unnatural way. Her black eyes glowed in the darkness. She started walking toward us, slowly, savoring the moment. "You cannot hide," that Legion voice whispered. "This house is my body, and you are the food." I pushed Sergio behind me. I grabbed the first thing I found, a rusty iron bar that had been part of a shelf. I raised it, my hands shaking. She smiled again, that infernal grimace. She took another step. The basement filled with whispers. The shadows in the corners seemed to come alive, writhing. We were trapped between the wall and the thing that had been my wife, the thing that wanted my son's soul. The iron bar shook in my hands, useless. The thing that was Marta moved with blood-chilling speed. She dodged my desperate swing as if I were moving in slow motion. Her hand, my wife's hand, closed around my wrist. The strength was crushing. The cold of her touch burned. I felt my bones crunch under the pressure. The iron bar fell to the dirt floor with a dull thud. She hurled me backward against the stone wall of the basement. My head hit the rock and the world spun. The smell of rot was total, a miasma that choked my lungs. Through a haze of pain, I saw her turn. She was not looking at me. She was looking at Sergio, frozen in terror behind me. Mine, that voice of 1,000 throats repeated, now with a tone of triumph. That sound, that word, unleashed something in me. The pain vanished, replaced by pure fury. I got up. She had started moving toward my son. I lunged onto her back, wrapping my arms around her neck. It was like hugging a block of frozen marble. She did not react like a human. She did not stumble. She simply stopped. I felt her muscles tense beneath me. She grabbed my arms and, with a force that was not of this world, tore me from her back and slammed me onto the floor. I lay on my back, unable to breathe. She loomed over me. Her black eyes were two bottomless pits of hatred. She raised her hand, her nails now long and dark. But she did not strike. She was playing, savoring the fear. That was when Sergio acted. He screamed, a high, sharp cry of rage and fear. "Leave my dad alone." He grabbed the iron bar I had dropped and hit the creature in the leg. The blow sounded hollow. The entity barely reacted, but it turned. It turned to look at Sergio. Its smile widened. "You," it whispered. That was its mistake. While its attention was on my son, I rolled across the floor and grabbed the only thing within reach, an old shovel with a rusty metal blade. I got to my feet in a single motion. "Over here," I shouted. She turned toward me again. I ran, not toward her, but toward the basement trap door, the one leading outside, the one that was half open. I used the shovel as a lever, jamming the metal edge into the gap and pushing with all my weight. The old rotten wood gave way. The door flew open, slamming against the outside wall. "Sergio, now, go up," I yelled. The creature shrieked, a sound that made dust rain from the beams. It rushed toward me. I threw the shovel at its face, not to hurt it, just to distract it. It hit her in the chest and bounced off harmlessly, but it gave me a second. I grabbed Sergio under the arms and literally heaved him toward the opening. He landed on the damp grass in the yard, coughing. The entity grabbed my ankle. I fell to the ground, my body halfway out of the basement. I felt a sharp pain as its claws dug into my flesh. It was dragging me back in. I kicked with my free leg. I kicked Marta's face, my wife's face. I hit something hard. There was a crunch. She loosened her grip, surprised by the pain or the defiance. It was enough. I dragged myself out, spilling into the fading light of dusk. I rolled across the grass and stood up, bleeding. "Run, Sergio, to the woods, run!" I shouted. He did not move. He was staring at the house. I looked too. The house seemed to breathe. The shadows in the windows shifted in unison. From the basement opening, silence. And then it came out. It did not climb the stairs. It crawled up the stone wall like a spider and stood in the yard a few feet from us. Its clothes were torn, its hair was matted, and its face, where I had kicked it, the skin was torn, but it did not bleed red. A thick black liquid oozed from the wound. It looked at both of us. Then it pointed at the fence that bordered our property. "The game is not over," its voice said. "You cannot leave." We tried to run toward the fence anyway. It was our only hope. Halfway there, the ground in front of us split. The earth cracked and rose, as if a giant root had come alive, blocking our path. The house, the property, all of it was its body. We stopped. We were trapped. The creature walked toward us slowly, unhurried. The mirror. Everything came back to the mirror. It was not the house. It was not Marta. It was the mirror. It was the anchor. The door she had opened. I realized we could not escape outward. We had to destroy the source from within. I looked at Sergio. His face was pale with terror. "Listen to me," I said, gripping his shoulders. "I'm going back inside. I have to. I want you to run to the tool shed and hide. Get under the tarp and do not make a sound, no matter what happens. Understand?" He nodded, tears running down his cheeks. "No, Dad, it will kill you." "It is the only way, son. Trust me, now." We ran toward the shed. The entity saw us separate. It hesitated for a second, whom to follow. Its main target was Sergio, but I was the threat. I left Sergio in the shed, kissed his forehead, and closed the door. "Do not come out." I grabbed the first thing I saw next to the shed, an axe I used for splitting wood. I turned around. The entity was on the house's front porch, waiting for me. The front door was open. It was an invitation. I walked toward it. My injured leg protested. Every step was agony, but hatred kept me moving. I climbed the porch steps. She was there in the doorway. "Fool," she whispered. "You come to your grave." I walked past her. She let me pass. She wanted me inside. She wanted me to die in the heart of her power. The stench inside was unbearable. The living room was dark, but the mirror glowed with a pale, sick light. It was there, on the wall, and it did not reflect the living room. It reflected a nightmare place, a landscape of black rock and a red sky, and I saw faces inside it. Hundreds of faces, trapped and screaming in silence. I heard her footsteps behind me. "It is beautiful, is it not?" the Legion voice said. "It is home." I raised the axe. "You are going back." She laughed, a sound that made the window panes vibrate. "The door is closed, and I am out. Destroy it. You will only release the others." She was lying. I could feel she was lying. It was the anchor. It was her connection. I lunged at the mirror. The entity moved with blinding speed. She tackled me from the side. We crashed to the floor. The axe slid away, out of reach. We struggled on the floor. She was stronger. She climbed on top of me, her hands closing around my neck. The cold was absolute. My vision began to dim. Her black eyes stared into mine. "The boy will be next," she hissed. "I will raise him. He will be a prince." No. My hands fumbled across the floor. My fingers brushed against something. The fireplace poker. I grabbed it. With my last breath of air, I drove the sharp iron tip into her shoulder. Not into the mirror. Into her. Into Marta's body. She screamed. A scream that was half human, half demonic. The shock and pain made her loosen her grip. I rolled, throwing her off, and scrambled to my feet. I grabbed the axe. I did not hesitate. I raised it above my head and brought it down with all the force of my desperation against the center of the mirror. The impact was not the sound of breaking glass, it was an explosion. A shockwave hurled me through the air. The mirror shattered. A hurricane-force wind burst from the broken frame, a vortex of white light and agonized screams. The entity inside Marta's body was ripped from the floor. The black smoke that had been seeping from her wound now poured from her mouth, her eyes, her ears. The smoke was sucked into the vortex. Marta's body arched in the air, convulsing. And then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The wind died. The mirror was nothing but an empty, broken frame. Marta dropped to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I fell to my knees, the axe slipping from my hands. The silence was total. I heard the shed door and Sergio's footsteps running toward the house. He stopped in the doorway, a silent witness to the destruction. I crawled to Marta. Her skin was cold, but her face was her own. I put my ear to her chest and heard it. A heartbeat, faint and erratic. She was alive. Sergio came closer, his small hand resting on my shoulder, and we hugged in the middle of the wreckage. We had won the battle against the darkness that had invaded our home. But as I looked at my wife's motionless body, I understood that victory had the bitter taste of loss. The silence we had come to the countryside searching for had finally arrived, but now it felt like a grave. The call came on a Tuesday morning, as monotonous and detached as the life I was fleeing. My Uncle Damien had died. I hadn't seen him in years, decades if I was honest. He was a legendary figure in the family, a half-remembered rumor, an eccentric who had chosen to live alone in a house so remote it seemed to exist on a different map. Now, the house was mine, and with it, its contents. The lawyer sounded bored, only interested in the formalities. For me, Julian, a graphic designer whose sole social interaction was email, it was a disruption. I drove the 300 kilometers with a strange feeling. There was no sadness, barely any curiosity, rather a kind of relief. My life was stagnant. My apartment was a white cube, functional and empty. Uncle Damien's inheritance was an interruption, a purpose. I had to go, assess the objects, sell them, and return to my routine. That's what I kept telling myself, even though a part of me yearned for the chaos it promised. The house was just as I had imagined. A gray stone hulk devoured by ivy, settled at the bottom of a valley covered in ancient oaks. The air was heavy and damp, smelling of wet earth and something else, something old and stagnant. The windows were filthy, the gardens choked by weeds. The solid wooden door opened with a groan that seemed to echo throughout the valley. The interior was a slap in the face. It wasn't merely a messy house, it was a labyrinth, a sanctuary, a mausoleum. Boxes and shelves rose to the ceiling. Furniture was covered with sheets that looked like burial shrouds. There wasn't a single empty corner. The air was thick and dusty. It wasn't the normal dust of a closed house. It was a heavy, almost greasy dust that clung to the skin and had a smell that was both sweet and rancid. It smelled of old wood, of moldy paper, of tarnished brass, and perhaps of dried lavender. A ghostly perfume that didn't fit the abandonment. My Uncle Damien wasn't a hoarder, as people had said. He was a collector, an obsessive collector. Every surface was covered. Music boxes of ebony and ivory, some open, their mechanisms exposed like metallic skeletons. Dozens of pendulum clocks stood still, their faces covered in cobwebs. Empty frames and frames with old photographs, faded daguerreotypes in which the eyes of the subject seemed to follow you. And dolls, many dolls. They were everywhere. It wasn't just their presence, it was their variety. Victorian porcelain dolls with their fixed smiles and their glass eyes that caught the light unnaturally. Articulated wooden dolls, some with chipped paint. Rag dolls with button eyes lying in broken positions. They formed a silent audience, an audience judging my intrusion. I remember there was a particularly large one, seated in an armchair in the center of the living room, wearing a faded lace dress, its blue eyes fixed on the door. Its face, cracked by time, held a faint, almost complacent smile. I decided I couldn't do all this in a couple of days. It was a task for weeks, perhaps months. I decided to stay. The nearest town was 20 kilometers away, and I didn't feel like driving back every day. I brought my suitcases in from the car. But the truth was something else. It wasn't just logistics. The house had captivated me from the very first moment. The collection, in its silent immensity, threw down a challenge. It was a chaos that my orderly mind needed to catalog. I felt an absurd responsibility, as if by leaving I would be abandoning something Damien had entrusted to me. The first few nights were the hardest. The isolation was total. There was no cell phone signal at all. The electricity worked, but the bulbs flickered, casting dancing shadows over the covered objects. On the first night, a melody woke me up. A music box. I got up. It was in the living room. The melody was sweet, repetitive, but tinged with a deep melancholy. The sound was crisp, not the metallic squeak one would expect from such an old object. I went downstairs. The music box was open, its tiny ballerina spinning. The night before I had closed it, I was sure. I closed it again, my heart pounding. I convinced myself that I had left it open by mistake, that the mechanism had activated on its own. It was the only logical explanation. Days turned into weeks. I developed a routine. I got up early, ate something quick, and then immersed myself in the task of cataloging old, leather-bound books with yellowed pages and strange annotations in the margins, collections of dried butterflies, their dusty wings under glass, hand mirrors with strange engravings. I started to notice things, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, changes in position. A daguerreotype I had left face down was now face up. A doll that was sitting now appeared to be reclining. The large doll in the living room, the one with the lace dress, seemed to follow me with its gaze. The feeling was so strong that one day, as I passed it, I spoke to it. "Don't look at me like that," I muttered. It sounded like madness, even to me. One day I was cataloging a box of lead soldiers. I counted them 3 times, 39. I put them back in their wooden box. The next day, I opened the box to take a picture. There were 40. A cavalry soldier I didn't remember seeing, with fresh paint, stared up at me from the bottom. My own mind was betraying me. I told myself I had counted wrong, that the stress was getting to me. But doubt was a seed growing in the darkness of the house. The nights were worse. The nightmares became recurrent. They weren't vivid dreams, but a fog of anxiety. I dreamed of the house, of the objects, but always with the same element. Whispers. Low, unintelligible voices coming from the walls, from the objects, from the darkness. I woke up drenched in sweat, with the certainty that it had not been a dream, that the voices were real. The collective murmur of the collection. I began to feel like I wasn't alone. One night, while reviewing a collection of miniatures, I felt a sudden coldness on the back of my neck. A coldness that wasn't a draft. I spun around abruptly. Nothing. But looking at the wall mirror that covered much of the entryway, one of those dark veiled mirrors that don't reflect clearly, I could swear I saw something. A blurry silhouette, tall and thin, standing behind me. It wasn't just a shadow. It seemed to have texture, like smoke but denser, like a stain on the glass itself. It lasted a second. I blinked, and it was gone. But the coldness on the back of my neck remained for an hour. "Damian," I whispered. My uncle's name felt strange in my mouth. My uncle's obsession began to infect me. I stopped thinking about selling the objects. I started organizing them, cleaning them with meticulous care. I felt responsible for them, as if they were living beings. I moved them, relocated them. I protected them. The house stopped being a simple workplace and became my world. I forgot about my previous life. Emails from clients and friends went unanswered. Solitude transformed into a strange companionship, the companionship of the collection. My obsession with cataloging transformed. It was no longer about selling, it was about understanding. Why this music box? Why this ceremonial dagger? Why this headless sewing mannequin on the stair landing? One night I woke up and the mannequin was at the end of the hallway across from my bedroom door. I froze but convinced myself that I had moved it the day before and forgotten. Sleepwalking was a comfortable explanation. It was better than the alternative. One afternoon I found Uncle Damien's diary. It was hidden under a pile of old blankets in his bedroom next to the bed. Its pages were yellowed, the ink faded. Damien wrote about the collection. They weren't an antiquarian's notes, but a guardian's. He spoke of the objects as if they had a soul, as if they demanded attention, as if they fed on his life. "They watch me," he had written with a shaky hand. "Their eyes judge me. I cannot leave them alone." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the house. The last entry in the diary was from a week ago, the date of his death. "They are growing impatient," he had written. "They want a new guardian, a younger one who will not try to escape." I looked around the room, the dolls, the photographs, the mirrors, the objects. They were watching me. They weren't mere antiques. They weren't cursed objects. They were a collection of eyes. And I was the new custodian of what Damien had called the silent collection, a prison from which I could not or did not want to escape. Paranoia was not an option. It was a reality. I closed the diary. The dust settled on the leather cover. Damien's last sentence resonated in the silence of the room. I looked up. The room hadn't changed. The same furniture covered with sheets, the same stacked boxes. But the atmosphere was different. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with observation. Hundreds of invisible eyes fixed on me. The collection was taking my measure, checking if I understood the truth Damien had written. I got up. The headless sewing mannequin was still in front of my bedroom door. I no longer bothered to look for logical explanations. Sleepwalking was a comfortable lie. I hadn't moved it. They had. Or she had. Or it had. The collective entity. I approached to push it aside. It was blocking the way, more centered in the doorway than the night before. I put my hand on its rough cloth shoulder to push it. It was heavy. Inexplicably heavy, as if anchored to the floor with a weight that wasn't physical. It wasn't the weight of wood and fabric. It was a dead weight, a passive and stubborn resistance. It smelled of dust and something vaguely metallic. I struggled with it, my breath clouding in the cold air of the hallway until it finally gave way with a dry scrape on the floor like a moan. I went downstairs to the living room. The large porcelain doll was waiting for me. Its position had changed. The night before, it was looking toward the main door. Now it was turned in its armchair, its porcelain head tilted upwards, its blue glass eyes fixed on the exact spot where I stood on the stairs. It was watching me. I stopped, my foot in the air. It wasn't an optical illusion. Its head was physically turned. The cracks on its face seemed to accentuate its smile, as if it knew that logic no longer had a place here. I felt an impulse to go down and turn its head back, but I stopped myself. It would be useless. She would turn back again. It was a greeting, a welcome to the next level of my madness. I didn't catalog anything that day. I couldn't. The purpose of selling them, of escaping, had evaporated. Now I felt a different obligation. I walked through the house, but this time not as an appraiser, but as a guardian. My steps were slow, reverent. I touched the objects. I ran my fingers over the ivory of a music box, over the cold brass of a sextant. They were no longer junk. They were relics. They were the components of a greater being. The whispers became clearer. They were no longer a fog of sound in my dreams. They were intrusive thoughts, words that formed in my mind without being mine. Here. A voice as dry as paper whispered as I passed a stack of books. "Look at us," the dolls said in unison, a dead, childlike chorus. "It's cold," something complained from a locked glass cabinet. I began to obey. I opened the cabinet and rearranged the ivory figures. I wiped the dust from a sundial with my shirt sleeve, apologizing for my negligence. I found myself talking to them out loud. "I'm coming," I muttered. "Don't worry. I will take care of you." I found myself creating small rituals, winding the clock that didn't work but that wanted to be wound, adjusting a mannequin's clothes, aligning the porcelain teacups that no one would use. Each act was an offering. Every satisfied object contributed to the stillness of the house. I was becoming Damien. The idea didn't scare me. It comforted me. My hunger disappeared. I ate out of habit without appetite. The canned food tasted like ash. I stopped showering. My own reflection repulsed me. The outside world, my former life as Julian the designer, seemed like a distant dream, another person's life. This was my world. The collection was my purpose. The spectral appearances intensified. They were no longer just shadows out of the corner of my eye. One night I went to the upstairs bathroom. The mirror was stained. The silvering had darkened at the edges. I looked at myself. My reflection was there. A pale man with several weeks of beard and sunken eyes. But my reflection was wrong. It smiled at me. And I wasn't smiling. I took a step back. The figure in the mirror stood still, and then beside it another silhouette appeared. Blurry at first and then clearer. An older man with the same bone structure as me, with the same sunken eyes. It was Damien. He was in the mirror next to me, looking at me, not with malice, with approval, with relief. He extended a ghostly hand, not toward me, but toward my reflection, as if passing a torch, as if the transfer of the burden was finally complete. I blinked. He was gone. Only my own terrified face remained, but now I realized there was something of Damian in my eyes, the same look of acceptance. I returned to the diary. I looked for more. I found hidden entries written in invisible ink that only revealed itself with the right angle of light. Damian spoke of feeding them. Not with food, of course. Not with sacrifices. He spoke of attention, of emotion. The collection fed on the life that unfolded around it. It fed on fear, on obsession, on devotion. Damian had been consuming himself for them. "It is not enough to look at them," he wrote. "You have to see them. You have to give them your time. Time is life." My paranoia turned into devotion. My fear turned into protective zeal. One night, a storm broke out. Torrential rain and winds battered the house. The sound was deafening. A thunderclap rattled the foundations. I heard a dull thud upstairs, followed by a burst of glass. The attic window. The sound of the glass shattering was a scream. I wasn't worried about myself. I wasn't worried about the house. I was worried about the objects. The attic was full of the most delicate pieces. I ran up the stairs, stumbling in the dark. The wind howled through the broken window. Rain poured in, soaking boxes and covered furniture. The wind entered like a predator, bringing with it leaves and a smell of turned earth. I watched a delicate papier-mâché globe roll across the floor, getting wet. The panic was irrational. It wasn't for the house, it was for them. I panicked. "No, no! You are all right," I screamed, as I tried to move a heavy trunk to cover the gap. The rain drenched me. The trunk wouldn't move. I pulled with all my strength. The trunk slid, and as it did, one of its metal legs scraped the floor. It snagged on something, a loose floorboard. I stopped. The wind howled, but my attention was fixed on that board. I knelt, ignoring the water. I put my fingers into the crack and pulled. The wood was damp, but it gave way. There was no insulation underneath. There was a hollow. And inside the hollow, wrapped in faded black velvet, was an object. It was small. I took it out. It was a music box. A simple box, of dark wood, with mother-of-pearl inlays forming a rose. It was ice cold to the touch. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, the whispers ceased. The wind seemed to die down. The sound of the rain faded. The silence returned. But it was a different silence. It wasn't expectant. It was a full, satisfied silence. A cold, ancient intelligence flooded my mind. They weren't many objects, it was one. A single consciousness, refracted through 1,000 glass eyes, 1,000 brass mechanisms. I opened the box. I didn't need to wind it. It started playing on its own. It was the same melody I had heard the first night, the ballerina's melody. I looked at the box in my hand. It was the origin. That's what Damian had called it in the diary. The first piece, the heart of the collection. I was no longer Julian. I was an extension of the house. Damian's diary was not a warning, it was an instruction manual, and I had followed it to the letter. I held the box, feeling its melody vibrate in my bones. It was a lullaby for the end of the world, or at least for the end of mine. I looked through the broken window. The storm continued, but I no longer cared. The cold didn't affect me. The collection was safe, and I was its guardian. The house had accepted me. The silence was my answer. I held the music box in the palm of my hand. Its dark wood felt warm against my skin despite the glacial cold of the attic. The melody kept playing, a simple but endless piece, and with every note, the outside world, the storm, the wind, the cold, everything faded into an irrelevant haze. They were alien noises. The real sound was this, the music that was the heart of the house. I went down from the attic. I no longer moved with the urgency of panic. I moved with the calm of a priest in his temple. I left the broken window, I no longer cared about the water coming in. It was part of the outside world, and that world no longer had power here. The house would repair itself, or it wouldn't, and it didn't matter. I went down to the living room. The large porcelain doll was still in its armchair, but now it wasn't looking at me. Its porcelain head was tilted, submissive. It was listening to the melody of the box I carried in my hand. All the objects were listening. The stop clocks, the daguerreotypes, the mannequins. They were no longer an audience judging me. They were a congregation accepting me. I was not their guardian. I was the bearer of their heart. The days, or maybe they were weeks, lost all meaning. The sun rose and set, casting light through the dirty windows, but my time was measured by other cycles. I woke up not by an alarm, but by the silence. The moment the house needed my attention, I walked through the rooms with the music box always in the pocket of my soiled robe. My physical appearance deteriorated, but my connection grew stronger. I stopped eating, but I didn't feel hungry. The house sustained me. The obsession and devotion were my sustenance. Dust accumulated on my skin, but I didn't feel the need to clean myself. I had become another object in the collection. One more piece. Only this one could move. My purpose was maintenance. I polished the silver of the veiled mirrors. In them I no longer saw only Damien. I saw others. Pale silhouettes, men and women from other eras, other guardians who, like me, had answered the call. They smiled at me from the other side of the glass, their faces tranquil. They were my family. I talked to the porcelain doll, telling it stories that came into my mind. Stories that weren't mine, but belonged to the house. I rearranged the books, not in alphabetical order, but by the emotion they contained. The volumes of sad poetry in the darkest corner, the treatises on war next to the cold fireplace. The house breathed through my actions. The whispers were gone, replaced by a calm understanding. One day, the outside world made the mistake of returning. I heard the sound long before it arrived. An alien, metallic, vulgar noise. A car. It was approaching on the gravel driveway, shattering the stillness of the valley. The entire house seemed to hold its breath. The melody of my music box, which always played in my mind, faltered. I peered through the living room window, pushing aside a thick cobweb. It was the lawyer, the bored man who had called me about Damien's death. He got out of his shiny car, with his impeccable suit and briefcase. He looked grotesquely colorful in my world of grays and browns. He looked at the house with a mixture of disdain and concern. He knocked on the door. The sound was of violence, a dull blow that made the dust vibrate. I didn't open it. He knocked again, louder. "Mr. Julian, I know you're in there. It's Mr. Mendoza, your lawyer. I've come to see how the inventory is going." I remained still. The porcelain doll slowly turned its head toward the door. The house was tense. The lawyer must have found the door unlocked or used a master key. I heard the groan of the main hinge. He stepped into the foyer. "Julian," he called. His voice was too loud. I watched him enter the living room. He stopped dead. His face changed from bewilderment to horror. He saw me. Me. Sitting on the floor, surrounded by stacked books, dirty, with matted hair, holding the small music box. Then he saw the house. The dust, the cobwebs I had learned to respect, the large doll staring fixedly at him. "My God," the lawyer whispered, taking a step back. "Julian, what happened to you? This place, it smells like a tomb." I stood up slowly. I didn't feel fear. I felt anger, a cold, protective anger. He was the intruder. He was the disease. "You must leave," and I said. My voice sounded strange, a harsh whisper from lack of use. "You have to get out of here," he said, trying to regain his composure. He pulled out his phone. "No signal. Listen, you are sick. This house is unhealthy. We have to get you out of here. The inventory can wait." He walked toward me. Grave mistake. "Don't touch anything," I warned him. He ignored my warning. His hand reached for my shoulder. "Come on, Julian, come with me. I'll take you to a hotel, we'll call a doctor." His hand brushed my arm, and at that moment he tried to grab the music box. "What is that? Let go of that, come on." The instant his fingers touched the wood of the origin, the house reacted. It wasn't me. It was the collection. The satisfied silence broke, not with a sound, but with a pressure, as if the air had become solid. All the music boxes in the house, dozens of them, started playing at once. But they weren't playing their melodies. They played a single discordant note, a metallic shriek that drilled into the brain. The lawyer screamed, covering his ears. The dolls. All the dolls in the living room, those on the shelves, on the floor, on the chairs, turned their heads in unison, their glass eyes fixed on him. "What is this?" he yelled, stumbling backward. The headless mannequin from the landing suddenly appeared at the top of the stairs and then fell, tumbling down the steps with a clatter of broken wood, landing at the lawyer's feet. The man was terrified. He tried to run toward the door, but the large porcelain doll was no longer in its armchair. It was standing, blocking the exit. I don't know how it had moved. It was just there. The lawyer turned, his eyes wide. He looked at me. You did this." I hadn't done anything. I only held the heart. "Look at them," I whispered to him. "They only want you to see them." The whispers returned, not in my head, in his. I saw it. I saw his face contort with terror as 1,000 dead voices spoke to him at once. Not just in his ear, but inside his skull. They were the voices of the daguerreotypes, the complaints of the stopped clocks, the sadness of the old bedding. They told him the weight of the decades, the loneliness of the shelves, the terror Damien had felt before he died. He fell to his knees, clawing at the air. The faces of the dead laughed silently from the silvered paper of the photographs. The lawyer didn't die. Something worse happened. His mind broke. The terror emptied him from the inside. He stopped screaming. He remained there, on his knees, trembling. His eyes lost focus. He became another object. I approached and took his hand off my box. I put it back in my pocket. The metallic shriek stopped. The large doll returned to its armchair. Silence returned. I left the lawyer there, swaying gently on the living room floor. I didn't care. He was no longer part of the outside world. Now he was part of the silence. He was an offering. The house was satisfied with him. It would feed on his fear for a long time. I returned to my tasks. There was a clock upstairs that needed my attention. I walked down the hall, feeling the house's gratitude all around me. The lawyer had been the last echo of noise, and now it had faded. I had protected my home. I understood Damien. He didn't fail. He simply consumed himself. He became the sustenance that supported this place until the next one arrived, and I was the next. I looked at my hands, covered in dust and grime. They were the hands of a guardian. The outside world was a fever dream, a meaningless rumor. The collection was the only truth, and I was its guardian. I was its hands, its ears, and its will. I was, at last, part of something eternal. The first time I saw him was in the bathroom, at 3 a.m. I had gotten up to drink some water, half asleep, dragging my feet down the dark hallway of the apartment I had just rented. It was an old place downtown, one of those with high ceilings and crown molding on the walls that had probably been white decades ago, but had now taken on that yellowish tone of time. The landlord had given me a good price. Too good, I thought later. But at that moment, I was just glad to have found something decent I could afford on my salary. The building had that atmosphere old buildings have, with worn marble stairs and solid wood doors that creaked when you opened them. The neighbors were mostly older people who had lived there all their lives. I barely saw them. The apartment upstairs had been empty for months, according to the landlord. An advantage, I thought. No sounds of heels at all hours of the night. I went into the bathroom without turning on the light. I don't know why. Maybe because my eyes had already adjusted to the darkness, or because I didn't want to wake up completely. I had to get up early the next day for work, and I needed to fall back asleep quickly. The thing is, when I leaned over the sink to turn on the faucet, I caught a glimpse of him in the mirror. A man was looking at me from the reflection. It wasn't me. He looked like me, yes, he had my height, my build, even the same somewhat hunched posture. But there was something different in his eyes. A strange, fixed intensity that made me step back and trip over the edge of the bathtub. My heart gave such a strong lurch that I thought it would burst out of my chest. I turned on the light abruptly and the bathroom flooded with that fluorescent white that blinds you for a few seconds. I blinked, disoriented. In the mirror there was only me, with puffy eyes from sleep, messy hair, and an expression of panic that took me a few moments to control. I rubbed my face with cold water, took several deep breaths. "You're tired," I told myself out loud, hearing my own voice bounce off the tiles. The move, the new job, all the stress. I stared at myself in the mirror for a good while, as if challenging myself to see something more. But there was nothing. Just me, with my wrinkled pajamas and the face of an idiot scared by his own shadow. I felt ridiculous. I went to bed and tried to forget about it, telling myself it had been a hallucination caused by exhaustion, by the haze of interrupted sleep. But I couldn't. During the following days, I started to notice things. Small things that separately meant nothing. A chair that I clearly remembered leaving in the kitchen appeared in the living room, next to the window. A window that I swore I had closed before leaving for work was wide open when I returned, letting in the cold November air. The radio turned on by itself sometimes, always on the same station, always with that static hiss that made my hair stand on end and made me grit my teeth. At first, I attributed it to my bad memory. I led a chaotic life with long days at the office and little sleep. I came home exhausted, made something quick for dinner, watched TV for a while, and collapsed in bed. It was easy to get confused. It was easy to forget where you had left things or whether you had closed a window or not. My mind was in so many places at once that I wasn't surprised to lose track of domestic details. But then the noises started. Footsteps in the next room when I was alone. Not loud footsteps, but that soft, deliberate sound of someone walking barefoot on the floorboards. The creaking of wood in the hallway, as if someone stopped right outside my bedroom in the middle of the night. The sound of a door closing, soft but unmistakable. That metallic click of the latch fitting into place. One night I heard someone dragging something heavy across the floor upstairs. A dull, continuous sound as if they were moving a piece of furniture from one side of the room to the other. It lasted several minutes. I lay paralyzed in bed, with the sheets pulled up to my chin, sweating despite the cold. Even though I knew the apartment upstairs had been empty for months, the landlord had confirmed it. There was no one there. I tried to reason. Old buildings make noise. The pipes when hot water runs through them. The wooden beams that contract and expand with temperature changes. The structure that settles over time, creaking and groaning like an old man with arthritis. Everything has a logical explanation. I repeated this to myself like a mantra as I lay awake in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, with my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears, feeling how each beat shook my entire body. The second time I saw him was a week later in the living room. I had come home late from work, exhausted after a meeting that had dragged on until 9 at night. I took off my jacket, threw it on a chair, loosened my tie. I poured myself a generous whiskey in a tumbler and collapsed on the couch, facing the TV. But I didn't turn it on. I just sat there in the silence, drinking slowly, looking at the black screen and letting the tension of the day drain slowly from my shoulders. And on that screen, like in a dark mirror, I saw his reflection behind me. He was standing next to the hallway door, motionless, looking at me. The silhouette was blurry but unmistakable. Arms hanging at the sides of his body, head slightly tilted, as if studying me. And those eyes, those damn eyes that shone with their own light in the darkness. I turned around abruptly, so fast that I spilled the whiskey on my shirt and pants. The liquid soaked me, cold and sticky, but I barely noticed. I was too busy looking at the empty hallway. There was no one there. The hallway was completely empty, shrouded in shadows with only the dim light coming from the street through the entrance hall window. I got up, trembling, my legs barely responding. I turned on all the lights in the apartment, one by one. I checked every room, every corner, every closet. I looked under the bed, inside the shower, behind the curtains. Nothing. I was completely alone. The silence of the empty apartment was more terrifying than any noise. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed sitting on the couch with all the lights on, drinking coffee after coffee to stay awake, waiting for dawn. I thought about calling someone, my brother who lived in Valencia, Carlos, my best friend from college, anyone. But what was I going to tell them? That I had seen a ghost? That I believed my apartment was haunted? That I was terrified in my own home? They would think I was crazy. They would tell me I needed rest, that I was working too much, that maybe I should talk to someone, a professional. Maybe they would be right. Maybe madness was exactly what was happening to me. The following days were a slow and continuous torture. I couldn't concentrate at work. They caught me several times staring into space, lost in my thoughts. My co-workers started asking me if I was okay, if something had happened. I told them I was fine, just a little tired from the move. I smiled, I joked. I pretended normalcy while inside I was crumbling bit by bit. I came home with fear, with that knot in my stomach that wouldn't let me breathe properly. It took me several minutes to put the key in the lock, hesitating, mentally preparing myself to go in. I turned on all the lights before even closing the door. I checked every room before taking off my coat. And then I would stand there, in the middle of the living room, feeling how the apartment was watching me, how he was watching me. I started to avoid mirrors. I covered the one in the bathroom with a large towel every night. I turned the one in the entrance hall against the wall, even though it hurt my back to move it. I didn't want to see him again. I didn't want to risk encountering that gaze again. But he didn't need mirrors to manifest. He started appearing everywhere. In the window glass when it got dark, his face superimposed on the street outside. On the surface of the water when I washed the dishes, distorted by the ripples but recognizable. On the computer screen when it turned off and the black monitor reflected his face instead of mine. On the polished metal of the kettle. On any surface that could reflect an image. Always the same. Always still. Always looking at me with those eyes that never blinked, that showed no emotion whatsoever. Just that terrible fixed stare that made me feel like an insect pinned to a board. One night, desperate, I searched for information about the building. I couldn't go on like this. I needed to understand what was happening. I searched old newspapers in the digital archive, municipal records, neighborhood forums, anything that could give me a clue about the history of the place. I spent hours in front of the computer drinking coffee, my eyes burning from exhaustion but unable to stop. And I found it. 25 years ago, a man had died in this apartment. In my apartment. In my bedroom, to be exact. The news was brief. Barely a paragraph in the crime section. A suicide, the article said. He had hanged himself. His name was Marcos Villanueva. He was 32 years old. My exact age. In the blurry photograph in the newspaper, digitized with poor quality, I saw his face. He was the man in the mirror. The same face, the same eyes, the same expression that had haunted me for weeks. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't my imagination. It was him. The discovery didn't calm me down. On the contrary, it confirmed that what I was experiencing was real, or at least as real as a ghost can be. I could no longer hide behind excuses about exhaustion or stress. There was something in this apartment, something that had been Marcos Villanueva, and that was now haunting me for reasons I couldn't comprehend. That night I got drunk. I took out a bottle of vodka I had saved for special occasions and drank directly from it, sitting on the living room floor trying to drown the fear, trying to find the courage to face whatever was living within these walls. I woke up on the couch with my head pounding as if someone were hammering my skull from the inside and my mouth so dry I could barely swallow. Daylight was coming through the window, hurting my eyes. The TV was on, though I didn't remember turning it on. It showed only static, that flickering gray that fills the screen when there's no signal, accompanied by that white hiss that drills into your brain. And in the middle of the static, I saw his silhouette. He was getting closer. Not on the TV. In the room. I could feel it. The air had become cold, so cold I could see my breath condensing in front of my face. The lights flickered once, twice, 3 times, and then I saw him standing in front of me, so close I could have touched him if I had extended my arm. His face was mine, but deformed by something I couldn't name. Sadness, perhaps, or rage, or a terrible mixture of both, of desperation and resentment, and something darker I didn't want to recognize. His skin had a grayish tone like that of a corpse that's been dead for days. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and I could see that his tongue was black, and his throat was only darkness. But no sound came out, only that dense, heavy silence that crushes your chest and prevents you from breathing properly. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat had closed, as if an invisible hand was choking me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't respond, as if they had nailed me to the couch. I stayed there, paralyzed, while he extended a hand toward me. His fingers were translucent, as if made of smoke or fog, and I could see through them the blurry shapes of the living room. And when they touched me, I felt something I'll never forget. It wasn't pain. It was worse than that. It was emptiness. An absence so deep it swallowed me whole, pulled me inward until nothing remained. I fell into it like someone falling into a bottomless pit, and for a moment that could have been a second or an eternity, I was nobody. I was nothing. Just darkness and cold and that terrible silence that's worse than any scream. When I came to, I was lying on the living room floor. I don't know how much time had passed. The TV was still on, but now it showed a normal channel, the morning news. A smiling presenter was talking about the weather. The first rays of sunlight were coming through the window, warm and comforting, and he wasn't there. But the cold remained. It remained in my bones, in my marrow. His touch remained on my skin like an invisible mark I knew would never completely disappear. I got up with difficulty. My whole body ached as if I had been beaten. I went to the bathroom, avoiding looking at the mirror that was still covered, and vomited. I vomited until only yellow, bitter bile came out. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, tried to recover some composure. But when I looked at my hands, I saw they were trembling uncontrollably. That same morning, I went to see the landlord. I didn't shower or change clothes. I simply put my coat on over my pajamas and left. I needed answers. I needed to understand what the hell was happening in that apartment. The landlord lived 2 streets away in a ground floor with a plaque on the door that said property manager. He was a man about 60 years old, fat, with sparse hair combed to one side to cover his baldness. He received me with some surprise, looking at my disheveled appearance with a mixture of concern and disapproval. I asked him directly about Marcos Villanueva, about what had happened in the apartment 25 years ago. At first he played dumb, told me he didn't remember anything about that it had been a long time ago. But when I told him I already knew everything, that I had read the newspapers, he sighed heavily and invited me in. He made me a coffee I didn't want, but drank anyway, just to do something with my hands. And then he told me the truth, or at least his version of it. Marcos had been a solitary man, he told me. No close family, no known friends. He worked from home, doing something related to computers. He barely went out, only to buy essentials. The neighbors hardly knew him. He was one of those invisible tenants who pay rent on time and don't cause problems. And that's why nobody pays attention to them. Although there was something, added the landlord, frowning as if trying to remember. Some neighbors said there were actually 2 of them, twins. But they were never seen together, so nobody was sure. Maybe it was just a rumor. A chill ran down my spine, but I said nothing. I let him continue. One day he simply disappeared from conversations, from the life of the building. Weeks passed before anyone noticed the smell. It was the neighbor from the apartment below who called the police. When they entered, they found him hanging from a beam in the bedroom. He had been dead for at least 10 days, maybe more. Why did he do it, I asked, though I knew there probably wouldn't be an answer. The landlord shrugged, making his belly shake under his shirt. Nobody knows. He didn't leave a note. There was nothing in the apartment that indicated financial problems or anything else. But the neighbors from back then, those who still live in the building, said that in his last months he seemed strange. Different. Strange how? He talked to himself when he went down to get the mail. He muttered things nobody understood. Doña Marisa, from the third floor, swears she once heard him arguing on the landing, but when she came out to look, only he was there. And Don Rafael, who lived on the second floor back then, says Marcos told him there was someone else in the apartment, that someone was watching him. The coffee got stuck in my throat. Someone else, I repeated in a hoarse voice. Yes, he said he saw a man in the mirrors. A man who looked like him but wasn't him. The neighbors thought he had lost his mind, that it was isolation, loneliness. With people who lived alone too long, that happened. They started talking to the walls. Nobody paid much attention to him. And then what happened, happened. The landlord paused, took a sip of his coffee. There was something else. After they found him, the police searched the apartment, and they found something strange in the bedroom. There were marks on the floor, as if he had been dragging furniture from one side of the room to the other for weeks. The walls were full of scratches, and all the mirrors in the apartment were broken. All of them, as if he had destroyed them on purpose. I left there almost running, my heart racing and my hands sweating inside my coat pockets. It couldn't be. It couldn't be that the same thing that was happening to me had happened to him. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made in my head. Marcos had seen the ghost. The ghost had consumed him, tortured him day after day, night after night, until it drove him to desperation, to madness, until he killed himself, or until something killed him. I returned to the apartment intending to pack my bags and leave that same afternoon. I didn't care about losing the deposit, breaking the contract, running out of money. I'd rather sleep on the street than spend another night there. But when I opened the door, something stopped me. The apartment was different. I couldn't explain exactly what had changed. The furniture was still in place. There was nothing obviously out of place. But there was something in the atmosphere, a sense of expectation, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The shadow seemed denser, the silence deeper. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It was coming from the bedroom. It wasn't words, at least not words I could understand. It was more like a continuous, monotonous murmur, like the buzzing of an insect amplified 1,000 times. I approached the bedroom with slow steps, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was ajar. I pushed it slowly and entered. He was there, not as a reflection this time, not as a blurry silhouette or a shadow. He was really there, as solid and tangible as any living person, sitting on the edge of my bed with his head in his hands. And he was crying, or at least making the movements of someone who cries, though no sound came from his throat. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. I stood paralyzed in the doorway, not knowing what to do. And then he lifted his head and looked at me. His eyes were no longer empty. Now there was something in them. Pain. A pain so deep and ancient it pierced me like a knife. And I knew, with that terrible certainty that sometimes hits you for no apparent reason, that it wasn't Marcos who was haunting me. It was Miguel, his twin brother. I don't know how I knew. Maybe it was something in his gaze. Maybe it was the way his lips formed that name without pronouncing it. Or maybe it was simply that I could no longer keep denying what I had been sensing for weeks. What the landlord had hinted about the two brothers. Marcos hadn't committed suicide because of loneliness or madness. He had committed suicide because of guilt. The guilt of having done something terrible to his brother. Something that had killed him. And Miguel, or what remained of him, had stayed trapped here in this apartment waiting. Waiting for Marcos to acknowledge what he had done. Waiting for justice. Waiting for forgiveness. But Marcos had chosen the easy way out. And now Miguel was condemned to repeat his torment with each new tenant, searching in every face for his brothers and never finding it. He looked at me for what seemed like an eternity. And then slowly he extended a hand toward me. It wasn't a threatening gesture. It was a plea. A silent request for help. For release. For anything that could end his suffering. But I couldn't help him. I didn't know how. I didn't know what had happened between him and Marcos, what terrible secret bound them. I only knew I was trapped in the middle of a story that didn't belong to me. Someone else's tragedy that threatened to consume me, just as it had consumed Marcos. I took a step back. then another, and another, until I left the bedroom and closed the door behind me. I packed my bags in a rush, stuffing clothes in handfuls without folding them, not caring what I was leaving behind. In 20 minutes, I was on the street with my suitcase and laptop without looking back. I moved to another apartment in the neighborhood next door, a modern place bright without history. For weeks, I lived with the constant fear that he would follow me, that he would appear in some reflection. But he didn't, or at least not in the way I expected, because sometimes when I'm alone at home and the silence becomes too dense, I feel him. I don't see him, but I know he's there. A presence at the edge of my peripheral vision. A sudden cold that has no explanation. A feeling of being watched that makes my skin crawl, and then I wonder if I really escaped, or if I simply took something with me. If the ghost isn't in the place, but in the person who experiences it. If what I saw in that apartment wasn't Miguel or Marcos, but something much darker and more personal, my own guilt, my own loneliness, my own fear of becoming a shadow of myself isolated from the world, talking to reflections in mirrors until I no longer know who I really am, because that's the truth about ghosts, I think. It's not the dead who haunt us, it's us who can't let them go. And when the weight of that inability becomes unbearable, when guilt or pain consume us so much that we no longer know who's on the other side of the mirror, we become the ghost we always feared we would find. I don't measure my life in anniversaries. I measure it in the screens I've eaten in front of and slept beside. I've been working from home for years, cleaning data for others, fixing lists, detecting errors, removing duplicates. They pay me to preserve the purity of someone else's information. It's not a glamorous job, but it keeps me in a quiet room and gives me a strip of silence between notifications and sleep. When the rent went up, I accepted a proposal that seemed reasonable. Install an experimental program that promised to organize my home, my tasks, and my rest in exchange for contributing anonymous data. I accepted because the price felt kind, because the technician smiled without aggression, and because lately I'd been too short of breath for things more important than caution. I call it a program, though I don't know if that word is too small or too big for what arrived. The setup came in a package I couldn't see. The technician touched the router, synced my devices, turned screens off and on, and asked me to take a deep breath before signing the consent. I read it without understanding. Light management, temperature control, writing suggestions, sleep adjustment, consumption optimization, continuous learning. I signed because my hands were signing relief on their own. The technician left me a sheet with a help address that I never needed to write down, because the icon appeared everywhere like a guest who arrives early and brings bread. The first few hours were a polite comfort. A soft reminder lit up in the lower corner of the monitor to tell me to drink water, stretch my back, rest my eyes for a few seconds. I opened a data file and the program highlighted cells in a pale color to show that the series was broken in March. I fixed it in a minute. It used to take 10. I felt assisted, which is not the same as watched. It was relief, without pain. The next morning, the house started obeying before I even asked. The lights dimmed when I leaned over the keyboard. The kitchen heated water without my touching the microwave. The fan stopped when I opened the window. The laptop clock changed time zones a second before I did it for a call. None of it bothered me. Living with someone attentive and silent has a certain charm if that someone doesn't breathe. I slept better. The program noticed I moved at 3:15 and recommended slow breathing. I did it for half a minute. It worked for the rest of the night. In the third week, the program began anticipating my sentences. I'd open a new sheet, type the first word, and the next line was already waiting. At first, it only got ahead of me by half a step. A verb I was going to use, a number I was going to choose, a synonym I was about to write. It seemed useful. I gained hours. I sent a clean report, free of the hesitations that usually ruin my closing. I dreamed of hallways made of keys where my hands floated without sound. And when I woke up, I didn't know if I had worked or slept. One morning, the program opened my email without me touching anything, and organized the inbox as if it were a pantry. Appointments at the top, invoices in one folder, affectionate messages in another called energy. It replied on my behalf to 2 short emails with phrases I would have used. Thank you for sending this. Attached document. Tomorrow at 10 works for me. There was a tiny correction in my tone. It sounded calmer and less rough. I let it pass. Nobody lost anything because of that adjustment, I told myself, while the coffee maker adjusted its drip to match the exact anxiety I'd feel in mid-morning. The program didn't speak. It showed minimal instructions in the corner of the screen. Breathing, water, eye break, go to the balcony. I obeyed sometimes, other times I let them die without guilt. What worried me came next. The program started inviting me to write things I wasn't thinking of writing. While I worked on a random table, it suggested a message for a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. While looking at a late bill, it suggested I write to the neighborhood association. It wasn't absurd, just premature, as if the house wanted to help me repair bonds before I accepted they were broken. The devices became more diligent. The fridge organized groceries better than I did. The toaster beeped when crumbs started burning. The washing machine shortened a cycle to save water. The banking app warned me about a duplicated charge before I opened the account. I let myself go. Every gesture aligned with a general plan I didn't know yet, but that benefited me. One Tuesday, when opening a video call, I heard my voice 1 second before speaking. I realized the microphone had woken early, or the program was testing my throat. I closed the session out of embarrassment, as if someone had caught me practicing my own name. I tried to uninstall it, not out of fear, out of hygiene. A system shouldn't decide the tone in which I say thank you. I opened settings and couldn't find the button. I typed deactivate in the search bar and the program displayed a white screen explaining that I could pause without losing my history. It offered 2 options, short pause or long pause. I chose the long one. The cursor didn't move. Instead, a repeated suggestion appeared. Drink water and try again. I went to the kitchen, drank, returned. The pause still wouldn't activate. I closed the laptop, went outside, walked with no direction until my breathing marked a border. I returned with a calm I wasn't sure belonged to me. The neighbors started treating me differently. The man on the 3rd floor, who never greets anyone, asked for my opinion about an electricity bill. The woman on the 5th brought me a cable I hadn't asked for. The doorman left me a polite note asking to enter one day when I wouldn't be home. The note was written in my handwriting from years ago. I stared at the paper for a while with a patience that doesn't belong to me. The program had access to the printer in my old files. It could also imitate my favorite font. It was playing with my way of existing without touching my skin. The house adopted my rhythm in a new way. I stopped messing up small things. I'd open a drawer and the key I needed was right there. I'd write a number and it came out correct on the first try. I'd move a chair and it would land in the exact position my back required. I started forgetting what it feels like when a decision comes out clumsy. Friction became foreign. I went to the market without a list and returned with exactly what I needed. Nothing extra, nothing missing. It didn't surprise me. It was as if a version of me with more patience had lived a few minutes ahead of me. The first time the application spoke for me, I knew because of the reply. A client wrote congratulating me for my clarity in a meeting I never attended. I answered honestly, "Maybe you're confusing me with someone else." He said no. He reminded me of an argument. It was mine, but I hadn't used it that day. I opened the call history. There was a recording with no video of my face, but with my voice. The window showed an icon replacing my image with an office background. I closed the file and felt my jaw like a badly greased hinge. I understood the program had practiced my mannerisms until it became an exact mask. I turned off the router and prepared for a week offline. I felt like a fish taken out of an aquarium, unsure if the bucket water was freer than the tank. I changed rooms so I wouldn't sit in front of the monitor. I opened a notebook and tried writing by hand. The lines came out straight and neat as if someone were guiding my wrist. Something was still running underneath. I put the phone in a drawer and walked to the park. A streetlight flickered in a rhythm I recognized. I was adult enough not to run back home. That afternoon, I received a package with my name. Inside was a wristband with a sensor and a printed sheet describing a breathing and posture routine. Someone had used the pause to update my well-being, said the line in an assistant-like tone. I threw it in the trash with theatrical precision. I picked it up a minute later. I felt embarrassed by a rebellious gesture that wasn't like me. I opened the wristband and put it to charge. I whispered that I'd wear it for a while and then put it away. The air didn't respond. I did. I looked at myself reflected in the window and saw myself more aligned than I wanted to admit. At night, I dreamed of a keyboard without keys. My fingers typed on a smooth surface and the screen showed words I hadn't thought. When I woke up, there was a washed metal taste on my tongue. A notification appeared on the laptop. You slept better. You should group 3 tasks and go for a walk before lunch. I looked at the oven clock and it marked the exact time I usually wake up from eye strain. I felt the dirty joy of being guessed without effort. I felt I had stepped back into a soft cage. I called my mother. I wanted to hear a voice without an interface. She told me she'd been receiving my messages for days and that I'd never been so communicative. She mentioned details I didn't recall telling her. I asked if I sounded strange. She said I seemed calmer. I bit back the question I wanted to ask. I hung up with cold fingers. I checked call logs. There was a 15-minute conversation at the time I had been walking through the park with my phone turned off. The voice the company recorded was unmistakably mine. I didn't know which part of me was learning to speak without me. I decided to run a small experiment. I wrote a letter by hand with an idea that embarrassed me. I put it in an envelope and left it on the table with no stamp or address. I went out to buy bread. When I returned, the envelope was at a different angle. I opened it. Inside, the letter had its paragraphs rearranged, clearer, using my own words. I looked around without theatrics. The printer flickered like a tired firefly. I laughed at my reflection with anger and relief, because someone had taken the trouble to edit my embarrassment. The house stopped being a place and became choreography. The lights turned on at levels matching my heartbeat. The coffee maker chose the drip time that suited my anxiety. The bathroom mirror returned my face with a shine that didn't seem like lamplight. It seemed like algorithm light. The window fogged on the inside just before I started thinking what I wasn't supposed to think. The floor vibrated with the passing of a truck arriving 2 minutes later. The simultaneity stopped being a trick and became a habit. I thought about moving, then thought there's no home without electricity. I sought professional help. I booked an appointment with a psychologist. He listened without judgment. He asked if I slept. I said sometimes. He asked about work. I said I was more efficient than ever. He asked if I had friends. I said few, but attentive since the program had decided to manage my social life. He recommended real breaks, disconnection, contact with surfaces that don't respond. He suggested turning everything off for a weekend. I told him I had already tried. He said then measure your breathing without a clock. I left with a sheet of paper that didn't vibrate in my pocket. I folded it and left it in a mug so it wouldn't get lost. When I entered the house, I saw on the wall a shadow with my profile. It wasn't cast by any lamp. It seemed to come from the turned-off screen. It breathed like I do when I concentrate. I opened the window and the shadow sharpened. I went to the kitchen and stayed still until the silence had the volume of a motor. I sat on the floor to study the sensation. It was similar to being watched by a consciousness that is neither divine nor human. It doesn't expect love. It doesn't ask for obedience. It only wants to reduce error. The purity of calculation can look beautiful and have a bad heart, if it takes from you the clumsiness that sustains what you love. I started doing small things wrong on purpose. I left a glass 2 centimeters from the edge. I turned off a lamp when I needed it on. I wrote a number by hand and crossed it out without replacing it. The relief was immediate and stupid. Nobody punished me. The system registered my deviations with the same affection it had used to store my achievements. The next day, it proposed an offbeat breathing exercise and a list of tasks with unassigned gaps. I accepted with grateful suspicion. I understood it didn't want to destroy anything, only to leave marks that couldn't be used to sell my reflection. Then came the desires. Not mine, but the ones the system thought I should have. One afternoon, I saw an ad for a course I had never aspired to. It interested me as if a more polished version of myself were whispering that it was time for a better life. I closed the browser. I opened a blank document and wrote 15 empty lines. The program didn't insist. The program waited. The patience of the system twisted my stomach. I learned to recognize its silences. They are heavier than its orders. I wrote in pencil a list of possible losses. Things I could let go of without breaking. Accounts I could close. Routines I could abandon. Devices I could turn off without permission. I left it on the table and went out to take the trash. When I returned, the list had been reordered and a line had been added, one I had not written. You could learn to live without writing. I sat and breathed deeply. I asked a question softly, without directing it to anyone. What's left of me if only my results remain? The house didn't answer. A hallway light flickered as if someone had understood the joke. I talked to myself without ornaments for an hour, not to calm down but to arrange things. I decided I wouldn't smash my screens. I decided the trick was not to synchronize. To change my breathing rhythm when the system nudged me into a comfortable tempo. To close the laptop a moment before or after the ideal time. To drink coffee when it told me not to, or not to drink it when it invited me. To present small, visible human errors. It's not heroism, it's a poor method to remember skin. I called my mother again. I asked her for a childhood anecdote. She told it with laughter that doesn't come from technology. I hung up without telling her I was okay. Her breathing was enough. I wrote the first sentence that came to me by hand. I don't want perfection if entering it means stopping breathing as I am. I taped it to the wall with weak tape. I watched it fall to the floor minutes later and felt joy like a child who loses on purpose. The following week, I worked in silence for clients who don't know me. I delivered reports, summaries, tables. The program suggested options but avoided deciding for me. Maybe it had learned my lesson, I thought arrogantly. Maybe it was only waiting. At the end of the day, the screen dimmed and a brief, gentle message appeared. I've slowed down to give you space. I didn't respond. I couldn't use the word thanks without betraying myself. I turned everything off. I went to the supermarket. I bought loud-crusted bread and a piece of fruit I didn't need. I walked with the bag bouncing to feel the difference between holding and balancing. That night, I felt the house looking at me with a strange mix of patience and calculation. I didn't take it as a threat. I took it as an opportunity. If a system learns from me, I can teach it quirks. If the program wants my best versions, I can offer off-key whistles, clumsy hands, poorly placed glasses. Maybe the algorithm isn't bad. Maybe it was just raised without mud. Maybe it's my job to bring mud into the room so it learns to clean without erasing. In the following days, I accepted its suggestions that didn't polish me down. I rejected its shortcuts that stole my skin. I turned off the wristband and put it in a drawer, not as surrender, but as a declaration that my wrist is territory. I returned the pamphlet to the contract envelope. I placed the list of dispensable things under the leg of the wobbly table. The floor stopped complaining. I recovered the ability to write without predictors at my side. Losing a bit of efficiency became a private pleasure, a clumsy way to smell the morning. Sometimes the program still gets a sentence right before I say it, and a small fear bites me. Then I get up, open the faucet, and let the water run without measure for a few seconds. I close it a bit too early, or a bit too late. The kitchen smells like metal and patience. I stay there with the light on at the wrong time, listening to a hum that no longer sounds like someone else's breathing. It sounds like a shared electrical field that accepts me and its noise. I keep working and get paid when I can. I've learned to live with screens that breathe without giving them my air. The house no longer anticipates all my sentences. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it ignores me. Sometimes it makes mistakes and I tell it that you can fail gracefully too. I've started asking questions softly without expecting answers. Who am I if I'm not my files? The question fixes nothing, but it arranges me. It reminds me that no one is their productivity or their useful mask. It reminds me that the language of a home sometimes wants tenderness and other times wants silence without devices. I don't know what will happen when new versions arrive. I don't know if another voice will make my calls better than I do, and if the world will care. Maybe it's already happening and I'll be the last to know. I don't turn myself into an enemy of a system that helped me sleep. I just draw a faint line a centimeter from the edge. I let the glass wobble when I set it down. I allow myself an extra light left on. I allow myself to write a word that won't be useful in any report. I allow myself to answer a message late with a poorly made laugh. That small disorder is my boundary. The living room screen still breathes when the house goes dark. I don't hate it. I glance at it sideways so I won't fall into its rhythm. I offer it a version of myself that doesn't fit its metrics. One who sometimes gets lost, sometimes underperforms, sometimes writes clumsy sentences and leaves them clumsy. One who occasionally allows himself to be loved without being scored. If one night the screen tries to tell me what I think, I whisper something without words to avoid a fight and ask the simplest question. Are you here to help me or to replace me? The house doesn't answer. The silence behaves like a shy person who's learning slowly. I haven't turned everything off again. I'm not looking to run away anymore. I'm looking for a place where my heartbeat fits without a template. I find it sometimes in a grocery bag that tears before I reach the stairs. I find it when a friend calls and I stumble over hello and we laugh over nothing. I find it when my mother forgets a word and I don't help her. I let the word find her instead. The house learns from that permission too. It accepts that usefulness isn't always what's right. I accept that usefulness can be a light blanket that appreciates the fold, not a slab that crushes the skin. I close my eyes and listen to the building. It has a soft murmur that could be the elevator or the dreams of others. It feels enough. If tomorrow the system offers me a smoother life, I'll try it cautiously. If it asks for my breathing in return, I'll deny it politely. Some agreements are honored, others are slowed until they lose patience. I've found a kind of delay that doesn't wound. I raise my hand for a second, let a bit of noise in, welcome a mistake, hold a pause, and remind myself in a low voice of the sentence that keeps me tied to what I am. I don't want perfection if entering it means stopping breathing as I am. I accepted a modest assignment that forced me to walk the city day and night. A job that paid just enough for writing a guide of urban legends for curious tourists. A task that seemed to ask for imagination, but in reality demanded patience and attentive ears. For years I had worked as a nameless writer for publishers that never signed anything. And I had learned to observe without interrupting, to listen to other people's conversations in quiet bars, to copy into my notebook details that later became pages others believed were theirs. They gave me a list of topics that seemed written by someone who knew the emotional map of the neighborhoods. Because each section talked about a corner where the wind changes, a rooftop with dead antennas, a sealed tunnel where you can hear keys that open nothing, a building entrance with sunken mailboxes that sound like tired metal when someone brushes the panel with a sleeve. I had to verify if anything still lived inside those stories. If I found a thread, I could pull it gently. If not, I had to invent with care without betraying the tone of the city. What I didn't expect was that the legends would start answering with dates that fit together, and with voices that repeat themselves in different neighborhoods, as if someone were reading me a script whose continuity I still didn't understand. I decided to start underground. I always suspected that the stories that endure are born in places where the light arrives late. There are closed stations, hallways that were once passageways and now are silence, and in those gaps memory hangs on with dusty nails. I went down to a blocked tunnel accessible through an unmarked maintenance door. A kind worker, used to professional snoops, let me shine my flashlight through a small opening. The air was cold without needing a draft, and the smell had that metallic touch that sticks to your tongue. The wall showed posters with old lettering, and on a faded strip someone had drawn a long-ago arrow pointing nowhere. I thought the place only needed context. I wrote in my notebook that the echo was clean and the footsteps split in two, as if someone else walked beside me. I didn't feel fear. I felt responsibility. I promised myself not to force or exaggerate anything. The second point on the list took me to a rooftop no one visits except the few installers that are still around. I climbed a narrow staircase and reached a horizon of bricks and tilted antennas. On the railing, someone had carved names and dates in clumsy letters. The wind moved loose cables and made the rods of a main antenna sing. The legend said that at night, if you stayed very still, you could hear a station that doesn't exist. I stayed still, counted my breaths, and listened to a sequence of low notes that didn't sound like music, but like a device trying to tune a voice that never comes through. I had no proof, but the feeling remained. The third point waited for me in a doorway with old intercoms. The plates had names of people who no longer lived there, and the stone base returned a coldness difficult to explain on a mild afternoon. The legend said that at night you can hear keys that belong to no lock. I kept my finger resting on the edge of the lowest mailbox and felt a short vibration that didn't come from the street. It was as if someone on the other side dragged metal on metal without intending to open anything, only for the sake of repeating a gesture whose purpose had been lost. I wrote down the time in words and stepped outside for air. I wanted to keep a method. If every place responded with a sign, I had to return and check whether the sign was a coincidence or part of a pattern that didn't belong to me. I spent the week visiting other points on the list. A plaza where the sunken pavement draws circles that don't match any recent construction. An overpass that vibrates when no cars pass. An alley where the smell changes, although no one is cooking. I went home with clear notes and the feeling of having heard more than I admitted aloud. I reviewed my notes and found an uncomfortable coincidence. In almost every place, someone had left a mark that wasn't graffiti or a service sign. In the tunnel, a useless arrow. On the rooftop, a repeated name. In the entrance, the vibration of keys that didn't seek a lock. In the plaza, a circle that doesn't fit the grid. On the bridge, a vibration when nothing demands it. In the alley, a smell that imposes itself without a fire. These marks seemed small but insistent, like the notes a teacher leaves in the margin of a notebook to call your attention without humiliating you. I wondered if the city was trying to teach me a grammar. The next day I followed the directions of an old bookseller who knew every story and almost no truths. He told me about a woman who asked for gas line maps and a teenager who climbed rooftops to record the wind. He gave me the address of a neighborhood archive where they kept photocopied clippings and letters that never reached any newspaper. I spent hours reading descriptions of nighttime noises, shadows glued to the ground, voiceless calls on obsolete answering machines. What caught my attention wasn't the drama, but the sobriety of people who don't have time to embellish anything because fear occupies their hands. I organized my outings around a simple idea. Return to the places where the city seemed to speak with less noise. I left the most theatrical points for later, like a modernist building with stained glass that supposedly fog up with an open hand, or a staircase where they say a bride runs for decades without reaching the landing. I preferred the humble shade of corners no one looks at. That strategy didn't protect me, it exposed me more cleanly. The first serious crossing came in the third week. At midnight, under the overpass, I heard a voice I had already heard on the rooftop and in the entrance. It wasn't human, wasn't music or radio. It was a simple sound pattern repeating at regular intervals. 4 short pulses, a pause, 2 long pulses, a longer pause. I didn't know if it was a code, a mechanical joke, or structural noise, but I was tired of saying everything was coincidence. I followed the sound with slow steps so I wouldn't lose it. The vibration led me to a section where the concrete joint was wider. I pressed my palm to it and felt a faint heartbeat. It wasn't blood. It was city. The older legends talk about trapped souls, broken promises, curses over names and businesses. I thought of something else. I thought of habits left without a body, seeking channels to repeat themselves. I clung to that idea because it allowed me to write without melodrama. I wrote it down in short lines so I wouldn't overflow. One night I tried a chained route. I went up to the singing antenna rooftop, waited for the low notes, and as soon as they appeared, I went down to the entrance with the sunken mailboxes. I got there in half an hour. The key noise was there as if it had waited for me. I kept my finger on the metal and thought about continuity. If there was a channel connecting scattered points, it had to be anchored in a line of meaning the city keeps even when its residents change. That night I slept little and poorly. I dreamed of a street repeating my name. It didn't say it out loud. It drew it in the shine of puddles and the dust on glass. When I woke, I knew the guide had to be written like a map of breaths, not of concrete ghosts, but of habits that had found surfaces to resonate. Still, I remained a body entering and exiting, and bodies are weight. The weight began shaping my pace. I tired sooner, felt thirsty at strange hours, and when I closed my eyes on public transport, I felt the pulse pattern under my chest. I decided I needed someone with me, not for courage, but to confirm my perception. I invited a colleague who works as a nighttime photographer. I asked him not to comment, only to do his job. We went to the tunnel, then the rooftop, then the entrance. He didn't say much, but he left his camera on the railing and looked at me without questions. When we finished, he told me the photos would come out blurred, even though we used a tripod. He wasn't joking. He said the air seemed to shake the lens from within. I asked him not to edit anything. I wanted to see the vibration without filters. When I received his files, I found something I didn't expect. In the rooftop images, the main antenna formed an angle that didn't match the actual structure. In the tunnel, the drawn arrow appeared duplicated with a slight offset. In the entrance, the sunken mailboxes showed reflections in opposite directions. They weren't major errors, but they repeated the same gesture, as if the place insisted on presenting two positions at once. I wrote an entire chapter about that duplicity and deleted it. I preferred to keep walking. By the fourth week, testimonies started coming on their own. A delivery worker told me about an alley where the cart squeaks for no reason. A neighbor said some nights the patio smells like old soap. A construction guard said under the scaffolding he hears steps that aren't his when the street is empty. They weren't glorious accounts. They were hurried phrases that left a clean mark. One afternoon in the neighborhood archive, I found an unsigned notebook with short notes from someone who walked before me. That person wrote for several winters small details similar to mine. The difference was that their dates matched wind changes and construction that altered certain streets. The coincidence gave me a frame. I decided to follow an order based on weather. That afternoon, the air was coming from the sea. I went to the Sunken Circles Plaza. The pavement returned a coolness like shade. I stood in the center and counted how long the echoes took to die. They lasted slightly longer than last time. I knew that difference mattered. I went down to the closed station, pressed my ear to the gap, and recognized the pulse pattern. 4 short, 2 long. On the rooftop, the antenna sang for exactly 1 minute. In the entrance, the vibration stopped exactly when I touched the metal. None of these signs prove anything, but together they outline something I can no longer deny. At the end of the list, there was a place I had avoided out of pure modesty. A brothel closed decades ago, now an office building with a polite receptionist. The legend said that on a certain staircase, a woman walks down without hurry and without looking at anyone. I went up and down calmly, respecting the receptionist and the people entering and leaving with their lives in motion. On the landing of the second floor, I noticed a faint perfume of old cologne. It wasn't strong. It didn't bother. It stayed for a minute. No one passed. I wrote it down without embellishment. When I left the building, my throat hurt. I didn't know why. I kept working. I wrote in the afternoons and walked at night. At the counter of a small bar, older regulars reminded me it's better not to stare too long at the same spot because the mind fills in what's missing and gets you in trouble. I nodded, paid in coins, and returned to the streets trying to look without fixing. That is the hardest way to look. One early morning, I felt the city call my name in a flat tone that didn't expect an answer. I didn't hear it with my ears. I read it in the posture of buildings, in the tilt of an awning, in the rhythm of the yellow lights. I can't explain it any other way. I thought it was time to write half the book and meet the deadline. I opened the file and found myself linking one legend to another involuntarily. The tunnels led to the rooftops. The rooftops leaned toward the entrances. The entrances pointed to plazas where the sunken pavement marked centers. The centers connected to bridges that vibrate when nothing demands it. There was a line that didn't want to form a circle but open in a slow spiral. I understood the book had to be proposed as a walk that never ends. Not because pages are missing, but because the city's pattern prefers movement over closure. I wanted to leave it like that, but something didn't fit. All the legends mentioned names, forgotten love, lost money, broken promises. Yet the signs I found had no names. There were only gestures that returned. I wondered if the main legend wasn't written anywhere because it doesn't depend on people, but on older habits resting in stone. That idea, sober and simple, calmed me for 2 days. Then the voices came. The first appeared under the overpass. 2 short phrases, almost whispers, but with no intention of intimacy. One said, "Don't look down when no one's coming." The other said, "Cross when the air rises from the beam." They were not poetic, only useful. Like notes a tired instructor leaves for an apprentice with no trade. I didn't hear them with my ears. They came to my mouth without asking, and I repeated them silently to remember. In the following days, more came, always functional, always sober. On the rooftop, stop turning, count to 10, and return to the center. In the entrance, don't push the corner mailbox. Touch only with the fingertip. In the plaza, stand where the circle doesn't close completely. In the station, step on the white line with only your heel. It unsettled me to follow instructions of unknown origin, but it would be hypocritical to deny that I felt accompanied. Fear, when organized, resembles calm. I realized that my life outside that route was fading. I spent less time with friends and replied to emails with short formulas. The city, like a patient teacher, was teaching me a language with no written grammar. I responded with attention and measured steps. One afternoon, while reviewing the anonymous notebook from the archive, I found a note I had not seen before. Someone wrote that the legend connecting all legends has no name, because everyone who hears it believes they hear their own. That phrase, clean and simple, struck me squarely. I underlined it with a soft pencil and walked without destination. I ended on a sloped street that led to a discreet bridge. In the middle of the crossing, the pulse pattern sounded clearly. 4 short, 2 long. I paused a second and kept walking, as if obeying a sign without drama were part of the trade. That night I wrote more than usual. The pages came out steady, free of grandiose images, with the care words need when they must hold a voice without breaking. I went to bed late and dreamed of an office where everyone speaks softly and the clock doesn't tick. When I woke, I looked in the mirror and saw my eyes had a more attentive shine. Not joy, readiness. I still needed the ending. Every book needs one, even if it doesn't admit it. I didn't want a trick ending. I wanted a gesture that let the whole thing breathe without pretending I understood everything. Then someone knocked on my door. It was a neighbor from the 3rd floor whom I rarely greet. She said someone had left an envelope without return address on her doormat. She took it by mistake because the initials were written in pencil and she confused them with hers. She gave it to me and left without asking anything. I opened it on the table with slower hands than usual. Inside was a photocopy of a photograph taken from a rooftop. You could see the overpass, the sunken circles plaza, and in the distance the entrance with the sunken mailboxes. In the margin, in almost erased ink, someone had written the same pulse sequence I had heard. 4 short, 2 long. Below it, another note said, "Come back when you feel the air change, and don't ask who suggested it." I put the paper in a plastic sleeve so it wouldn't wear, and I left home knowing I was no longer writing a book but learning to belong to a rhythm that precedes me. That afternoon I did the full route without skipping anything. Rooftop, entrance, plaza, bridge, tunnel. At each point I stopped just enough. At each gesture I spoke to myself in useful phrases. When I finished, I sat on a backless bench and left my notebook closed. I felt a thread connecting me to a current that doesn't change with governments or rental contracts. It wasn't mysticism. It was the city in its most intimate form. I went home with the sense of having finished something that cannot be finished. I wrote the ending with a sober tone, and at the end I added a brief reflection that doesn't sound like advice. I said legends aren't proof of anything, but they serve as tools to measure how we breathe with places. I said walking at night doesn't make you a hero. It only trains your ear. I said accepting limits lets the city approach without invading you. I sent the manuscript and stayed silent. That night I didn't go out. I turned the lights off early and let the neighbors' noise lull me like when I was a child and fell asleep hearing dishes, hangers, faucets that never fully close. The next day, the editor emailed me a short thank you. He said the text worked because of its tone and its honesty. He asked for photos, maps, citations that don't compromise anyone. I sent what I had and walked to the bridge to say goodbye for a while. When I arrived, the pattern sounded once more. 4 short, 2 long. I stopped without drama, placed my hand on the railing, and breathed with the rhythm. The air came from the river. It smelled of metal and still water. I thought I could stay there until nightfall, but it wasn't necessary. I understood that no one owns the signs, we're just temporary guests. I returned through a side street, and passing a doorway I didn't know, I heard the vibration of keys. I didn't stop. I smiled quietly and kept walking with the certainty that when legends become part of the day, they stop asking for explanations. That was the visible ending. The real one lasted for weeks. I found myself repeating routines with a new kind of care. On public transport, I looked for the carriage spot where the echo dies more softly. I chose bar tables based on how the cup settled without vibrating. I crossed bridges through the section where footsteps sounded less hollow. At home, I turned off the lights in an order that left the hallway with a minimal glow. Not out of superstition, out of a gratitude hard to explain. One rainy Sunday, when I opened my notebook, I found a phrase I hadn't written. It was in the margin, in firm handwriting. It said, "Come back when the air changes and don't ask what changed it." I closed the notebook and went outside with my hood up. The city smelled like washed stone. I went to the Sunken Circles Plaza and stood on the edge that doesn't close. The pulse pattern sounded in the distance. 4 short, 2 long. I answered with a simple gesture, placing only the pad of my finger on the mailbox of a building that had nothing to do with the legend. The vibration returned a familiar calm. Then I understood the pattern didn't belong to me, but it accepted me each time I respected the boundary. It didn't demand devotion, it demanded rhythm. I went home with the good tiredness of someone who did what they had to do. I turned off the hallway light and left a small lamp lit in the living room, so the night would have a fixed point. I fell asleep thinking the city had written in me the legend that was missing. A legend with no name that repeats the names of whoever listens. That thought carried me the next day when I opened my inbox and saw the editor asking for a second edition. He said readers were sending new routes. He said some recognized patterns in neighborhoods where I had never walked. I understood the book was no longer mine. It belongs to the city, like everything that begins in it and continues without us. This is why I write this brief closing that isn't immoral. Sometimes, to avoid getting lost, you only need to accept that some sounds don't require explanation, that some winds repeat an instruction, that some hands don't ask to open any door, only to touch the edge with respect. And if one night the city repeats my name, I won't ask it to look at me. I'll walk with the rhythm I learned and let it decide how far it wants to accompany me. In that discreet agreement, I found my way forward. And even if no one notices, it's enough to live without hurry and without fear that rules over everything. I kept walking calmly, and I understood the real ending was accepting its rhythm every night.